And so good morning to everybody. Not legal advice here with Frank Nez. Good morning, Frank. I'm really happy to have you with us today.
I appreciate you having me on your show, and good morning to everybody.
Yeah, and I appreciate your work product. And I mentioned we were off. I was talking that Ham mentioned you today, and he appreciates what you do because there's not a lot of people presenting that side of the state of the world. And I always find it funny in my position because a lot of people I deal with are I would label them conservative. I'm not, but I have the same concerns that they all have. They don't even know my politics really, but I'm moved by the same nonsense that they are, and I really appreciate your angle. So maybe you could tell us a little bit how you got involved in journalism.
Yeah, journalism, as we've seen recently, it has been very important, especially with the massive distrust we have with mainstream media, right? So for me, really, when I got started in journalism was during the meme stock frenzy, really, back in 2021. So essentially, what happened was I started to see mainstream media publishing all of these articles telling people to stay away from AMC stock, GameStop, and it didn't make sense to me, especially when there was such a high short interest. I figured, well, you would think these platforms would want investors to make money, right? And so the opportunity was there. And so I thought, why are these platforms trying to get people to sell or get away from these stocks? So I found that extremely fishy. And I did not appreciate how mainstream media was attacking the community as well, retail investors. And so I felt a sort of duty, right? A sense of duty to use my platform and really speak against what we were seeing. And so that's really when I got into journalism and I started reporting, um, you know, basically everything that was going on during that time with retail investors, etc.
Yeah, I goofed, of course. I first should have said this is not legal advice, not financial advice, maybe not even journalistic advice, probably not advice of any sort. So don't
Right.
take it as such. And I goofed because as I warned Frank beforehand, but I gave him the privilege to 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 elicit any jokes that he would like. I said I had a couple that I usually start off with that I forgot to do, of course. So since I became a full-time freelancer, I've made quite a few sales. And I'm sure you can identify with this, Frank. I sold my car, my house, and my clothes. By the way, none of these jokes have to be funny. That's part of the trick. Why are writers always cold? Maybe you know the answer to this one, Frank. You know?
I'm not entirely sure.
Um, why are writers always closed? They're surrounded by drafts.
There you go.
Okay. And last but not least, what's the difference between a writer and a large cheese pizza?
Tell me.
The pizza can feed a family of three.
That's a good one. There you
Okay.
go.
All right. One of them has to be decent. And of course, none of those apply to you. Now, one thing that I was talking to you about off the air today a little bit about was the capybara situation. And, I label, everybody refers to mainstream media. Myself, so I have a Tesla background also, so I follow Tesla carefully. So I kind of decided I don't like that label because I find it kind of ambiguous myself. So the way that electric cars refer to the like GM, they refer to them in a particular way, and I think it applies to media too. So the way I refer to that media as legacy media, that's that old style media that really doesn't exist now because anybody can have me anybody can have their own little crappy platform, which I do, could say anything and could be as valid as anyone else, really.
Of
and
course.
and I don't know how you view this, but one thing I find really difficult is being able to sort through information that has validity and information that doesn't. So how do you, I mean, as a writer, how do you deal with that stuff?
Yeah, so for me, it's always been about storytelling. And I think journalism is truly about that, storytelling. Now, I find that it's important to tell the story from the perspective of what the people are going through and layer it with facts, known facts that are out there. And so, one thing that I began to do when I first started covering the MMTLP stories is I started putting the facts of what was occurring with FINRA and with the community. But I also got a chance to hear the stories of the people, and I was able to publicate that. And for me, it's always been about storytelling. Now, the issue comes from these bigger media platforms twisting these stories or not necessarily telling people stories, but rather a narrative that maybe they're trying to create.
Yeah, it's frightening, obviously, because there's no way of knowing, one, because it seems like many platforms will publish things notwithstanding whatever it says. We've had that occurrence again in the capybara matter, and I had personal experience. So my background is I'm a lawyer. My background, so I've been involved, had some little involvement, but TD Ameritrade, for example, they may have a newswire, so they may publish something on a newswire without regard to whatever the content is. And, you know, I would think that would be kind of a crazy position to take, but that's the position they took when I like confronted them on that. So those people reach a lot of sources. And again, it gets back to my original question. You're the person, the end user. You get this piece of information. For most people, it's not reasonable to be able to go out and search out and spend 5 hours on internet checking all sources. And it ends up really as propaganda in a way. It creates some type of view that's not supported by the facts. And I agree also, there is so much money. There is so much money that's available to support that, to support the misconduct. I was going to ask you, so, you know, you got involved in MMTLP. So give me your your overview picture. I presume you never had any experience with a security like MMTLP before this, correct?
Yeah, no, that's correct. So what's happened with MMTLP is just it's such a bizarre story, right? And I've heard this before from investors. So unlike any other stock, any other company out there, if you're at a loss, you can cut your losses, right? You can't do that with MMTLP. That is completely like something that is on the other, for example. You can't do anything with that. So it's unique in that sense. And it's also unique because there's been transcripts that have surfaced of matters regarding fraud in MMTLP. Now, these were transcripts that were occurring between the SEC and FINRA. And you didn't hear the media talk about this. So it's a very different play here. So I think this is why it's very important. And I love to see other community members from, let's say, AMC or Mullen even stand behind retail investors in MMTLP.
Yeah, I thought so. I'm a member of that community. I thought that I'm shocked that the other communities haven't been able to structure. And it's not like, you know, you're familiar with the MMTL community. There's obviously issues that exist within a community, just like there's issues that exist in any community and issues that exist within any family. And, you know, a year in or more than a year in, with a lot of people losing their life savings, with many people losing their lives, it's not to be unexpected that there's going to be some, you know, strife. And there is, that's fine. But to keep it together enough to continue to push seems to be a novel concept. Because I would think kind of what you were saying is groups like AMC, GME, all those groups should be doing the same thing. They should be battering Congress's doors down because, there's only 65,000 MMTLP shareholders, but there's millions of others. And Congress, I'm not a big fan of politics, not a big fan of either party, not really. I don't believe, I'm not a trusting guy of them, but I do believe they do react to numbers, and bigger numbers will have a bigger influence. So I'm thankful for the MMTLP community, and I'm going to throw out a little bit for you. Maybe this is kind of novel to you about the MMTLP situation. So maybe you could use it in some way. So I'm in an arbitration with MMTLP. I sued Fidelity because I have a Fidelity account. And I'm lucky enough, I am an attorney, even though my specialty is not securities. I've learned a lot over this time. So I've been involved in an arbitration, a FINRA arbitration. We're fighting about it. But the things that interested me that came out, which I think most people don't focus on, is, and I have a letter. So I have a communication from Fidelity, not to me, dated November 15th, 2022. U3 halt is December 9th, 2022. I bought my shares the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th of December. But on the 15th, there's a letter internal at Fidelity from the ethics department that says they are not selling any more MMTLP shares. That's November 15th. After November 15th, you were referring to the FOIA replies, that communication between the SEC and FINRA, where they raise the issue there's fraud, or they assert there's a fraud. And that's December. The first one of that is December 2nd. So that's 2 weeks later. There had been a prior communication, October of 2021, where there was also reference to a fraud investigation, but nothing beyond that. Then we get to December, and then December 4th, there's another one of those communications. And in that communication, they indicate they're already blue sheeting MMTLP, MMAT at that time. And I hadn't bought my shares as of that point in time. So the way I see it, we have November 15th, Fidelity in a letter says we're not going to sell it. December 2nd, we have a starting of a pattern of, between the regulators, they're acknowledging some fraud and they blue sheet Fidelity. And after that, Fidelity sells me the shares, and then we get the U3 halt. So I find it interesting, that sequence. It's a very short, narrow time frame. I don't know what would have happened to permit Fidelity's ethics department. Again, I find it interesting that any brokerage actually has an ethics department. This doesn't seem to be certainly important, but that somehow the ethics department takes a position, and 2 weeks later, with a fraud investigation, and after being blue sheeted, it's okay. So that's my unique little situation, but the facts I find really interesting. So for me also, it was a unique experience. I had no background with MMTLP, but I'm a member of the community. And just like you were saying, you felt compelled, you had a platform, which I really appreciate. And I was going to ask you about, you speak a lot about banking, and I really am interested in your position about banking. But do you have any ideas about how you think the because this is what people ask, how you think the MMTLP situation is going to end?
I don't have a clear answer to that question, but what I can say is that the community has done an incredible job at really raising awareness and really putting themselves on the radar, right? So what started as something that I personally think regulators wanted to sweep under the rug ended up completely blowing up in their faces. And I'm proud of the community for that. I remember Busy Brands had reached out way back when this was first happening. And I remember he wanted me to take a look and see if I can publish a story on it. And the deeper we got into this, the more publications that came out, the louder the community got. And so because of that, we were able to just really raise awareness on this. And we had Bloomberg touch topic on it. We had Wall Street Journal touch topic on it. And although the stories weren't what we necessarily wanted to hear, we were still able to get that ticker out there in that sense. So for me, journalism is extremely important. And what those people did from those platforms was not journalism. And I've considered those people as simply staff members of those big companies. They're not journalists. Journalists, they speak out, they protect people, and they were not doing that. But I just felt it was important to state that, because I know there are some people in the community who have brought that to my attention as well. So,
have you had the chance to have any contact with any political people or regulators about the issues of naked shorting or anything else?
No, not directly. Not directly. We did have a congressional report come out recently, which they cited about 3 of my MMTLP reports, which was good to see. It was good to see that those reports that I had published were being cited.
Now, I'm asking this because it happened to be cited. So Brandon K, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He's from Forbes. He's published several articles basically negating the existence of naked shorting, like it doesn't exist. And just and the reason why I have particular interest, I would have no interest, by the way. But in my arbitration, Counsel for Fidelity attached as part of their answer his article. So it's in the proceeding, in the legal proceeding. And Morgan, Lewis, and Bacchius represents Fidelity. And the irony is, Ham was saying today that they represented him way back when. And he told me at one point in time, he actually trained a lot of their lawyers in like the fine points of what naked shorting was and the like. So I find it interesting. So he's attached. His article is attached, and I'm trying to depose him because if it were a normal case, if we were in court and somebody would attach something like to the answer, I would take the guy's deposition the next day, and I would inquire as to what the basis of his opinion is, and whatever. And maybe he's brilliant, and maybe he could justify everything. It was just interesting, and I have a question I'm going to get to. It was just interesting that one of the articles he wrote, he basically said naked shorting is BS, and at the same time there was Sabi, and then that got taken down by the SEC. And right. I don't know if you're familiar with Sorrento Therapeutics. Was a bankruptcy case where the judge actually found naked shorting and they forced cover. Same period of time. So it was interesting. So my question is, when you hear other journalists, and I put that in quotation marks because I don't know, one question I would ask somebody like that, I'd ask you the same question, by the way.
Sure.
If I was deposing this gentleman, the first thing I'd ask is anyone paying you for your opinions, and what opinions? And I'm sure, usually when people are under penalty of perjury, they usually are truthful to stuff that's not going to get them in deep trouble. So I would expect him to answer truthfully if he's getting paid by somebody, but that might be an uncomfortable question for somebody in that position. So when you hear journalists like that make claims that probably are not in line with your own claims, how does that make you feel as a journalist?
Well, as I stated, prior to that question, they're just staff members, really. The company has control of the narrative to the extent, right? Something I don't appreciate as a journalist is something that, as I mentioned, journalism, I think, is really about exposing and putting the truth out there. So when you have somebody like that really trying to cover up, knowing that there's evidence of this out there, that it exists, it makes you question things, right? It makes you question, is there a motive behind this? Is there someone in their ear, a puppet master who might be trying to really take control of the narrative? And I think this was because retail investors got loud. I think we got loud. We got the attention of these bigger media companies, and I think they want to throw their own spin on it. And the best way to do that is to use these people, right? These so-called journalists. They're the ones publishing this stuff. They need a name behind it. So I think that's really what that is. There's a motive. There has to be. There has to be.
Yeah, cynical me. I put that. I'll call myself out. But when I see that, immediately I think, somebody's getting paid off. That's
Right.
kind of my conclusion. And would that be so outrageous a conclusion if that's what justification was? I don't really think so. I think that's it happens. It happens.
Right.
Money obviously is a big influencer. That which leads me to my next kind of topic was why do you think regulators don't do more to protect retail traders? And so I'll throw it out. You don't have to say it, but I throw it out as, some things that occur to me, and, you could add whatever occurs to you, but, there's no picket line. There's no fence dividing the two. So if I'm working at the SEC, I can get a great job at Goldman Sachs when I'm done, and it gives me a big leg up. So there's not an incentive for me when I'm at the SEC to do anything to Goldman Sachs. That's one part. And two, I think they're just straight graft and corruption. There is so much money. How much did Citadel, what was their profits in 2023? It was like, 50, $60 billion. So, if you're going to pay off a few tens of millions of dollars to get influence, I think that's what you're going to do. So, yeah, so that's what makes me suspicious of why regulators don't act. Perhaps you have a different take on that.
No, it's literally that, and the term they use is lobbying, right? But it's really bribery, So I think that has a lot to do with what's flowing through the pipeline of what's creating this sort of weird stance with our regulators, right? They're really just there for lip service. They're there to look good. They're there to be that public figure that is meant to look like they're supposed to protect retail investors and just put regulation out there. But like you mentioned, there's a lot of money that's flowing. And so it's easy for these people to be lobbied, and it's a real problem. I mean, if we look at Hester Pierce, for example, she's connected to a lobbyist group of anti-regulators. So that's a big problem. There's just so many conflicts of interest that is really preventing the system to work for the people. It's like a private club within all of these people. It's really wild.
Yeah, a private club with billions of dollars to kind of fund their efforts. You mentioned Ari. I was thinking when you were saying Ari Rubenstein. You've heard that name before, GTS. He's considered to be one of perhaps the market makers that let MMTLP trade originally in October of 21. Purportedly, we don't know for certain, but at the time that he's doing that, he's also on an advisory committee of FINRA. So, how are you expecting those people to properly police themselves? It's ludicrous, but again, they have it kind of always goes back to the issue of the money. There is so much capital available to get the influence they want. And I've not been around in this area a long time, but it appears starting with the MMTLP, something that's happened is there's been a lot of public exposure of this. And it doesn't seem like there was before this, because when I'm like you, on X, Twitter, Spaces, all the various, you hear people and you hear new people that didn't know about this. And there was no way of knowing about it, pre-social media. I don't think it was possible to spread the message. And I'm wondering, and I don't know how you think about this, but do you think at some point in time there's going to be a breaking point where there's just going to be just so much public information known that there's going to be no way to withstand the scrutiny, and there's going to have to be change?
Yeah, absolutely. This is why I've always preached raising awareness. I mean, you either raise awareness or you don't. And if you don't, nothing is ever going to happen, really. The best bet here is to raise awareness, because if we get loud enough, they will be forced to listen, right? There just comes a point where if we get too loud, certain things start coming out, and they cannot have that happen. So, I mean, we've seen this throughout the years as well, where what's one way that they can silence the people, right? They remove certain content creators from certain platforms. We saw this on YouTube during the meme stock frenzy. Some YouTubers were getting removed, then reinstated and removed again. So what does that tell you? It tells you that when people get loud enough, that's what they're afraid of. Because when the dirt literally surfaces, they have no other option than to do something about it, because it could just get deeper and deeper and deeper. So I agree with that.
Yeah, and I think, and I remember, and I don't remember the number, I was probably in junior high school, and they said, when you're a child, to learn a word, you got to hear it like 60 times before it actually sinks in. So it takes a lot of redundancy. So here we are, I'm referring to myself, not you, by the way. Here we are, a bunch of clowns, have no idea about this. MMTLP is super complex. It's not like normal run of the mill. So we have learned this story over the past year, but it takes a lot of repetition because it's super complicated. So I remember, and I think this is a natural process. Somebody who's not familiar with this starts hear you talk, they tune out. One, because it's just confusing, and two, because they think you're full of it. Because if you're not exposed to this sounds like nonsense, conspiracy nonsense. And again, when I started, I had no idea of the extent of the naked shorting, none. And I would have disbelieved it. So I would have been one of those people that had to be kicked in the head enough to finally see enough. And after a while, when you see it, you see it, right? And you can't unsee it. So now, the way I think of it, this is the matrix, really. This is the red pill and the blue pill. Once you see it and the market is basically on a bunch of stilts, it's propped up.
Right.
You can't unsee that anymore. But it takes everybody else a lot of repetition. And that's why I appreciate Ham. He goes on every day, notwithstanding whatever the attacks he gets, and he goes through. And William does the same story. I'm sure William also. And there's a bunch of people that have their own channels, and they repeat the same story because it requires that. And it's difficult. It really is difficult. I don't know if you had that experience of it, if you had some doubt and it took you a little while to kind of grasp the severity of the problem.
Of course, it's just all about consistency. So is that these consistent actions is what will be required of all of us to really but continue that momentum, because in the past year, there's been a lot of momentum being built by the community. So it still requires that consistency. While the MMTLP story has gotten a lot of traction, that consistency is going to take it to the next level. And I agree on that. We have to remain persistent with this.
And there's, I think, a whole litany of securities. Well, there's probably every security is impacted, but the securities that are most impacted, there's Mullen, there's a whole list, Mullen, GTII, Finger Motion, all the ones that we see constantly, they're all impacted by this. And I don't know if it's going to happen, but everybody suspects in those communities that if one goes, so if we pull back the curtains and we expose it, so one is successful, that everybody's going to be successful, because then the claims, because it comes back to this, everybody's making the same claim, basically the same claim. We're all being ripped off. There's naked shorting, counterfeiting of shares, and just it's very difficult to prove because the system is set up in a way that makes it difficult to prove.
Right.
But once it happens, it's going to be tough to kind of, put the genie back in the box. And I can only imagine, I think about this, not that I have any sympathy for these guys. And I don't know how you think. I was going to ask you about how you think about Gensler, but they must have a very difficult job if they know the extent of the problem, because the remedy, it's got to be a really difficult remedy. So
Absolutely.
do you have an opinion about Mr. Gensler?
Yeah, I mean, look, like you just mentioned, this is a really like very deep problem. If they're really aware of everything that's happening, which they have to be, right? It's really going to be a very difficult weed to really pull out, especially after all of these years of the system working that way, right? With the SEC chair, it's just difficult to really understand what is happening with him. There comes times where he looks like he's for retail, but actions speak louder than words, in my opinion. And we haven't really seen much action. It's
and he knows
difficult. It's challenging.
And he knows about MMTLP. I mean, he's been
absolutely.
He's been confronted about it. I know Ham talks about the truck being in front of his office. So it's not like they don't know. They're just pretending, pretending. In fact, one hearing, I remember he was questioned about it, and he feigned a lack of knowledge for a second, but then had a specific detail about it. So it was interesting how it goes. Yeah, those. My concern is about somebody like that. Is he runs out the clock on his term. He's got a term, and he can, excuse my language, but he dicks around for a while. He pretends to do something. Maybe there's a change in president, and maybe he elects to leave at that point in time. And maybe he thinks, this is what I think in the dark recesses of my basement. No basements here in California, by the way. But that, some of these guys might be running out the clock. I wonder about Cook, the CEO of FINRA, who are just, an atrocity with immunity, so they kind of can pretend to thumb their noses. I wonder, these guys, and I think Cook makes about a little under $4 million a year, so that's a pretty good job. But they don't seem to do much, and they certainly don't do much for retail. Right. And I'm hoping, I don't know if you're familiar with the case before the U.S. Supreme Court, Jarkessi, SEC versus Jarkessi. It's trying to limit the internal judicial powers of the SEC. And you're familiar with Alpine, GTII, and there's another case called Kim, and those are against FINRA. Same thing, where there's a question, they're trying to limit the internal judicial system of FINRA and reduce the power of all the regulatory agencies. So the Jarkessi case, the decision will come out before June. And if it comes down where it limits the power of the SEC, I think that's going to be the first in a long series of judicial decisions that remove power away from the regulatory bodies, and especially those SROs like FINRA that are I don't understand. That's a entity that's not the government, but has immunity, and so you can't do anything to them, even if they screw up
Right.
intentionally.
Yeah.
That just doesn't seem right. So one thing I wanted to touch on, and this is the part that catches my attention mostly about your work product, is your work on the banking uh, and your position, because you're always talking about interesting capital changes at various banks. And what caught my attention, at least most recently, was what happened at Silicon Valley Bank, and that the fact I always thought it was funny is that the regulators are like 10 miles away from them. Literally, the bankers are literally 10 miles away from them, and the SEC, all of the regulators could have walked in and could have figured out what was going on, but did not. So, but I'd like to hear your take on banking in the U.S., because that seems to be something that you're very knowledgeable on.
Oh man, the banking system is just a whole other can of worms. Truly, there's just many issues with it, right? Um, and I feel just like Wall Street, it's a corrupt system all around. A lot of the publications on my site in banking really have to do with a lot of the stories as well, as to what people are going through, right? Within the banking system, they're also being cheated, just like Wall Street cheats retail investors. But we have these banks that are also playing a huge part in the markets. In They're the biggest lenders, right, for these institutions. So they play a massive part in what is happening economically, stock market, especially as well. Um, but it's another serious problem. It's definitely another can of worms. But it's it's something that I don't see a lot of people really touching topic on, which is why I briefly do get into it here and there. But
What's
it's
your is your biggest concern is just a collapse of the system, or
uh,
what's your like your in your mind, what's the most likely concern you have to occur based on how the system's structured?
well, I think that the people are going to be the ones affected, Richard. It's always going to be the people affected the most, right? So we have these banks that are essentially, some at least to an extent, are perceived to be too big to fail. And I mean, we've seen JP Morgan get such small fines compared to the amount of revenue they receive. So it just it gets you to question really, like what is really happening? Who's really in charge? These guys, they can commit illegal activities. They can screw over people and never really truly pay the price for it. It's messed up because there's no justice within the banking system. So that there is a huge problem in the country.
Yeah, I always thought, and I think it applies to the SEC and FINRA too, because Alpine is the example. Is my perfect in the perfect world? Alpine is the poster child for what are you doing? And I'm referring to the regulators. Between 1984, 2022, convicted. That means either they were found to be liable or they acknowledged liability 39 different occasions. I don't mean like they committed 39 violations. I mean there were 39 different occasions in which they either acknowledged liability or were found liable, which means they probably engaged in that activity thousands of times where they weren't caught. And
Right.
then and then they had a convicted, admitted sex offender being their point person to deal with the regulators and tried to make him as the point person of the company with the SEC. And then on top of that, they were found to have ripped off clients. This is after those events. So the SEC and FINRA have had a chance to intervene. They've intervened, but nothing has stopped. They then ripped off a bunch of clients. That's the findings. They ordered them out of business, but because of this internal judicial system, it's a very complicated process after they get kicked out. And there was a cease and desist order that says they couldn't rip off their clients. They ripped off their clients 36,000 more times after that, literally 36,000 times, when the SEC then decided to intervene, which caused the appeal, which is now pending. But with that, blatant theft,
Right.
having a convicted sex offender, it's almost like, sounds like it's made up. But with that, all they got were fines, and the SEC and FINRA aren't collection agencies. So they don't go out and press these people to collect the money. So they might issue a fine, but nothing. And kind of like what you were saying, JP Morgan gets fined $50 million on something they might have made $500 million. They say to themselves behind closed doors, good job. That's all it is. Yeah. So you wonder, too big to fail is fine, but at some point in time, it could fail. If the system, if it's all just propped up, then at some point in time, there could be an event. We've seen events in our lifetimes that influence the market dramatically, and they're unexpected, and there's no way to prepare. In this country, I don't know how it is in other countries, but in this country, we're very reactionary. So we don't prepare for much of anything. We react after the fact, and we deal with the mess. But that's why I appreciate what you do by referencing that the banking issue, because I don't see it, as you were saying, I don't see it referenced at all. I hear William speak about it occasionally, but we don't know if the financial system. Why would the banking system be significantly better than the stock market? Why would we expect that?
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion about you've heard other countries that are trying to deal with naked shorting, like South Korea, I think, Thailand, et cetera? Do you have any opinion? Or were you surprised to hear about that?
Yeah, I found it very interesting once that sort of news began to come out, and I felt it was important to share. So I published a few articles on my site based on what's happening in South Korea. I think it's incredible that they are now restricting, banning these sort of manipulative ways to trade the market, right, through naked short selling. So I think, everybody would want the United States to, do something like that. But I think that because the U.S. is built on capitalism, it gives them that loophole, right? And they've used it. So even if the SEC wants to really tackle that issue, these institutions can always use that capitalism card as a loophole, which is unfortunate, but there has to be another solution.
I guess the original idea was, it provided liquidity, but there's no shortage of liquidity at this point in time. So it's just a bogus reason.
Absolutely.
It's not needed. And and Ham says this, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I find it immoral. There's so many medical biotechs that some of them are going to produce solutions to problems that might affect any of us. Some of them may save our lives. And how anybody is able to use economic means to suppress medical cures, that just can't be. I just don't think that should be permissive.
I agree. It's unethical, and I think it's un-American to do that, right? We want our companies to strive. We want innovation to grow, and we want to provide and create value in the marketplace. We want to ensure that the economy grows. And with all these advancements being completely broken down by these institutions, by these hedge funds. It's 100% unethical.
It also kind of, retards technological growth, right? So all these
Absolutely.
companies, whatever, let's say 5% of them are, I understand that most companies, they're trying for home runs. So most of them will probably fail, but 5% might succeed. And that 5% might create new technologies that aren't going to be created because they didn't get that
100%.
chance. And there is no justification for it. I think that should be one of the first areas that should be addressed in the stock markets, because it hurts everybody, even the schmucks who are the shorts. Their families get sick too. So one day, it's kind of, it'll occur to them, oh, it'll be too late. They would have screwed themselves, but they screw, so many other people in the meantime. It's really a disgrace in this country. I don't know if you saw today at China, I think it was today, they're combating naked shorting in their own markets. They're restricting naked shorting, I think, for almost all their traders. That was today. So It's interesting. It's interesting how it's lining up. I hope that the American regulators don't have too much involvement in assisting all these other
Right?
countries, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I don't think they would be looking out for the best interests of those countries,
And I love that we're starting to see this news in Asia, right? Banning naked short selling. Because here's the cool thing, though. Here in the US, we can raise awareness of what's happening there. We can really raise awareness on that. And in a way, it's promoting this incredible thing that's happening there.
Right.
People will see it here. People will share it here. And it's going to get on the table of regulators. Whether they can do something or not about it, that's out of our control, right? But I feel like as long as we continue to focus on what's in our control, which is speaking out, raising awareness, I think we have a good shot.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's not just in our country, because now, people are speaking up, but if 90 countries come out and they say this exists, it's hard at that point in time to withstand that, the logic of that. So I agree with you. And Ham says that, and what you said is education. Just kind of keep on communicating it, because obviously we could see it. It obviously does have influence. It's just not, unfortunately, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not an immediate fix, but it's a deep fix, because people understand. It's when you really understand something, it gives you a lot of confidence in a position. So it really helps people promote it. So I appreciate your view on that. I don't want to keep you any longer. You stayed longer than you said you were going to stay, so I appreciate that. Is there anything else you want to state to the people out there, or anybody who sees us down the road?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Richard, for having me on your show. I wish your channel a lot of success.
Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you to the entire community who has really supported the news blog. Right, we've been able to, in my perspective, in my view, really create something very powerful here. And I think that we really couldn't have gotten to this point in time without the community, without you guys. So every single one of you guys who are sharing videos, posts, articles, you guys are playing a very important role in all of this. And so I just want to say, keep up the great work. And the number one way, in my opinion, to find a solution is to just continue to raise awareness.
And what's your X handle? Could you say it for everybody?
Yeah, it's at FNEZ_blogger.
Great. No, I think you do great work. And before we leave, I just want to say that I once asked my literary agent what writing paid the best, and he said ransom notes. Anyway, Frank, it was a delight having you. I hope to have you back down the road, maybe when events call for it, and we can talk some more. I really appreciate your work, and keep up the great work. Have a great weekend, and I'll keep watching and reading your blog and everything you put out. And again,
it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
thank you for coming on, and take care.
You
And
too.
everybody out there, be well, have a great weekend. And like I always say, if you post a comment down the road, I look at every comment, and to the extent I can respond in a reasonable fashion, I will. To everybody out there, be well, take care, and have a great weekend.